Hi, my name is Nick Schaefer, Social Studies instructor at St. George's Technical High School, and for this particular lesson, we are covering the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Leading up to this point, we've covered World War II, the beginnings of World War II in the Pacific, in Asia, and in Europe. So what we ended up having students do was look at two perspectives, the Japanese perspective on the attack on Pearl Harbor and the American perspective of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So for today's lesson, we are looking at highlighting for bias, and we're also looking at margin writing so we don't forget what we've already read. So what I ended up doing with students was I took the Japanese perspective of the attack on Pearl Harbor and I modeled what I expected the students to do when they received the American perspective on Pearl Harbor. So you'll see that I am deliberately highlighting just for bias within the text, and at the end of every paragraph, I'm margin writing so I can remind myself after the fact what each paragraph was really ultimately about. I wanted to choose this strategy in particular because as a historian, we're always looking for bias when we're reading primary sources. We don't want to take anything for face value, and we want our students to understand that just because it's written in text doesn't mean it's always true. So the outcome of this lesson was to teach students what bias is, what to look for in regards to finding bias, and how we can compare that with other perspectives to find the actual truth hidden within. So after I was done modeling the Japanese perspective of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the students in pairs worked on the American perspective of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and they also highlighted for bias and also margin wrote at the end of every paragraph. So by the time that we got to the end of that particular perspective, the students now knew what the Japanese and how they perceived the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Americans and how they perceived the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the students then wrote a summary on the facts that lined up with one another by both texts. And they gave me an unbiased summary of what actually happened on the attack of Pearl Harbor. And then I gave them a new text, which was a secondary source of what actually took place on the day of Pearl Harbor. And they matched what their summary said compared to what was actually in the secondary source. I was pretty impressed by the end of this activity because most of the students were able to find the bias and were able to pull out the facts that aligned with both perspectives. And they were able to see that their summaries really matched what the secondary source was saying. And I could see that they were proud of their own accomplishments. And they were able to tell me after that day's lesson what bias was pretty quickly and easily. And they're automatically now looking for bias when I hand them primary sources.
Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to focus on the attack of Pearl Harbor, and we're going to look at 2 points of view, the Japanese and the American. We are looking specifically for bias and how bias can affect how people perceive the same exact event. I am going to model the Japanese view with you, so I'm going to ask that you watch and you look and see what I'm doing. So when I hand you the American point of view, you guys are able to use what you've learned to do the exact same thing. At the end, we are going to compare and contrast, see what facts actually align with one another and what doesn't align. And we'll compare and contrast the two. So I'm going to have you guys, when you guys get the American view, 2 things. Some kind of writing utensil and a highlighter. I'm going to ask that you highlight for bias as we go through the text. So let's go ahead and begin at the beginning here, and it reads, the Japanese attack fleet left its home waters on November 26, steaming a circuitous route towards Pearl Harbor. Fleet Commander Vice Admiral Nagumo received his final orders on December 1st, and on the morning of December 7th, the battle group was in position 275 miles north of Hawaii. At 6 a.m., the first elements of the air attack, consisting of fighter aircraft, torpedo bombers, high-level bombers, and dive bombers were aloft and assembling in the pre-dawn gloom. So at this point, no one's really talking here. This is just background information getting us ready for what's about to really go down when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So moving down, Commander Misao Fuchida led the first wave of the air attack and published his recollections in 1951. They were later published in English in 1955. We join his story as he approaches the Hawaiian coast. So right here we see who we're talking about. We are living Commander Misao Fuchida's life right now. We are reading his words and how he experienced the attack on Pearl Harbor. So we're going to start seeing the bias take place on the bottom here and the next page or two. So continuing, it reads, 1 hour and 40 minutes after leaving the carriers, I knew that we should be nearing our goal. Small openings in the thick cloud cover afforded occasional glimpses of the ocean. As I strained my eyes for the first sight of land, suddenly a long white line of breaking surf appeared directly beneath my plane. It was the northern shore of Oahu. So we see that we are getting closer and closer to the Hawaiian Islands. So that's what this first one represents here. So Japanese fleet can finally see Hawaii. Veering right toward the west coast of the island, we could see that the sky over Pearl Harbor was clear. Presently, the harbor itself became visible across the central Oahu plain, a film of morning mist hovering over it. I peered intently through my binoculars at the ships riding peacefully at anchor. One by one, I counted them. Yes, the battleships were there all right, 8 of them. But our last lingering hope of finding any carriers present was now gone. Not one was to be seen. So as he's coming closer to the islands, he starts seeing all of the battleships. They were already told what battleships were going to be there. So all battleships are present. And in his view, he didn't see any aircraft carriers. Could there have been some there that he didn't see? Yeah. So are we 100% sure that he is accurate in what he's saying here? No. So at this moment, it could actually be seen as potential bias. We're not quite sure if he's seeing all of the ships that are currently at Pearl Harbor. It was 0749 when I ordered my radio man to send the command, attack. He immediately began tapping out the prearranged code signal, tow, tow, tow. Leading the whole group, Lieutenant Commander Murata's torpedo bombers headed downward to launch their torpedoes, while Lieutenant Commander Itega's fighters raced forward to sweep enemy fighters from the air. Takahashi's dive bomber group had climbed for altitude and was out of sight. So he's kind of telling us the order in which these attacks are taking place, correct? Now, as a reader, we could take this at face value. We could look at this and go, yeah, he's right, this is probably exactly how this went down. But we're not quite sure. So we want to make sure that this point of view is accurate. So I would highlight the chain of actions that are taking place. So he claims the torpedo bombers were first, and that then they started using planes. So when we look at the American point of view very soon, we want to ensure that those two accounts match, because if they don't, something's not right here. So these are a chain of actions leading to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Alright, so far so good? Any questions as far? Kennedy?
So did you not highlight that first and second part because it's potential bias or?
So I'm only highlighting what I think may be bias.
Okay.
So the reason why you don't see anything actually highlighted here is because it's mostly background information,
Okay.
leading us to the point where he's finally telling us his story. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, cool. So let's flip to the back side. And continuing on, it read, my bombers, meanwhile, made a circuit toward Barber's Point to keep pace with the attack schedule. No enemy fighters were in the air, nor were there any gun flashes from the ground. Yet again, We don't know if this was 100% accurate and true, so I would highlight that, and this would yet again, I would mention compare to American point of view. The effectiveness of our attack was now certain, and a message, surprise attack successful, was accordingly sent to Akagi, which is a flagship of the Japanese attack fleet at 0753. The message was received by the carrier and duly relayed to the homeland. Now, of course, do the Japanese want the people back home and the government back home to believe that the attack was a success? Absolutely, right? So, of course, they would say that the surprise attack was successful. We don't know what it looked like from the American point of view. It may not be successful. It may have been very successful. So let's highlight this. So this could be potential bias. We're not quite sure yet until we compare it to what actually happened in the American point of view. The attack was opened with the first bomb falling on Wheeler Field, followed shortly by dive bombing attacks upon Hickam Field and the bases at Fort Island. Fearful that smoke from these attacks might obscure his targets, Lieutenant Commander Murata cut short his group's approach toward the battleships anchored east of Fort Island and released torpedoes. A series of white waterspouts soon rose to the harbor. Lieutenant Commander Itaya's fighters, meanwhile, had full command of the air over Pearl Harbor. Yet again, there's one word that kind of strikes me as odd here. He says that they had full command of the air over Pearl Harbor, as if there were no American planes flying at that time. So this is another one where we might want to check for accuracy. Because remember, this is only coming from one Japanese point of view. So other Japanese fighters may have seen something different. American soldiers on base could see something different. About 4 enemy fighters which took off were promptly shot down. By 0800, there were no enemy planes in the air, and our fighters began strafing the airfields. My level bombing group had entered on its bombing run toward the battleships moored to the cast of Fort Island. On reaching an altitude of 3,000 meters, I had the sighting bomber take position in front of my plane. As we closed in, enemy anti-aircraft fire began to concentrate on us. Dark gray puffs burst all around. Most of them came from ship's batteries, but land batteries were also active. Suddenly, my plane bounced as if struck by a club. When I looked back to see what had happened, the radio man said, "The fuselage is whole and the rudder wire damaged. We were fortunate that the plane was still under control, for it was imperative to fly a steady course as we approached the target." Now it was nearly time for ready to release, and I concentrated my attention on the lead plane to note the instant his bomb was dropped. Suddenly a cloud came between the bomb site and the target, and just as I was thinking that we had already overshot, the lead plane banked slightly and turned right toward Honolulu. We had missed the release point because of the cloud and would have to try again. So, we can probably take this at face value. This Japanese soldier clearly was trying to hit a target and they missed. And he mentions that he has to go back to try to hit that target again. If he is openly admitting that he made a mistake, we can probably safely assume that what he said here is probably accurate. So we would write probably accurate because the soldier admits he made a mistake. Alright, while my group circled for another attempt, others made their runs, some trying as many as 3 before succeeding. We were about to begin our second bombing run when there was a colossal explosion in Battleship Row. Yet again, key term colossal here. That could go either way. It may not have been as big as he is claiming it was. A huge column of dark red smoke rose to 1,000 meters. It must have been the explosion of a ship's powder magazine. This was the battleship Arizona. The shock wave was felt even in my plane several miles away from the harbor. Right now, he's just kind of being extremely descriptive and using imagery. We began our run and met with fierce anti-aircraft concentrations. This time, the lead bomber was successful, and the other planes of the group followed suit promptly upon seeing the leader's bombs fall. I immediately lay flat on the cockpit pit floor and slid open a peephole cover in order to observe the fall of the bombs. I watched 4 bombs plummet toward the earth. The target, 2 battleships moored side by side, lay ahead. The bombs became smaller and smaller and finally disappeared. I held my breath until 2 tiny puffs of smoke flashed suddenly on the ship to the left, and I shouted 2 hits. So yet again, this is a description of an attack on battleships. No bias mentioned here. He's still just kind of telling us what's kind of happening during the chaos that's taking place at Pearl Harbor. When an armor-piercing bomb with a time fuse hits the target, the result is almost unnoticeable from a great altitude. On the other hand, those which miss are quite obvious because they leave concentric waves to ripple out from the point of contact, and I saw 2 of these below. I presumed that it was Battleship Maryland we had hit. So yet again, he's presuming, yet again, not telling us that's exactly what he hit, but he believes he hit the Battleship Maryland. So believes he hit the Battleship Maryland. So while we're reading the American point of view, we want to make sure, does it say anything about the Battleship Maryland? Is it brought up? Are we seeing people on the Battleship Maryland? Their point of view? Are we seeing something happen to the Battleship Maryland from outside of that battleship? So we will always want to make sure that we're keeping in the back of our heads that if this comes up and it may have been sunk, what other evidence do we have that might support that? As the bombers completed their runs, they headed north to return to the carriers. Pearl Harbor and the air bases had been pretty well wrecked by the fierce strafings and bombings. The imposing naval array of an hour before was gone. Anti-aircraft fire had become greatly intensified, but in my continued observations, I saw no enemy fighter planes. Our command of the air was unchallenged. And yet again, he makes this claim that there were no enemy fighter planes. So we also have to check for accuracy, because it might have just been where he was, or that might be 100% accurate. Maybe the Americans couldn't get to the planes in time. As the first wave of the attack made its way back to its carriers, Commander Fuchida remained over the target in order to assess damage and to observe the second wave attack. He returned to his carrier after the second wave successfully completed its mission. So we see at the very bottom here, this is an overview again, and it already hints to us that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a success. So this was a successful attack by the Japanese. So before I have you guys pair up, I want you guys to start looking at your notes again. When I hand out the American point of view, use this as a reference to help you find bias. We are looking for commonalities and differences, and then we'll compare and contrast those when we reconvene to see what you guys came up with.